Record.
Hi, and thank you for joining us today. We are the HR group, and today we are going to be discussing bad bosses and how to deal with them. And one of the topics we're going to start with is the characteristics of a bad boss, how bad bosses affect organizations and employees, and how to approach dealing with a bad boss. So today we have Brandon Torres, Sarah Rosinski, Diego Gamboa, and Michael Goss. And I'm going to start here with you, Brandon. Can you describe some characteristics of a bad boss that you've come across in your industry and with your experience?
Sure. Thinking about a bad boss, I think this is a bit of a two-pronged answer. First, it's sort of how do you as an employee identify a bad boss? And some of these could be easily identified. As an employee, you'll find that they do things like micromanage your work, provide input on every detail, and that can lead you to feeling disempowered due to having no autonomy over your work. Conversely, they can provide zero oversight and not really be informed of the work you're doing, leaving you directionless and not really knowing how you're doing in your job. As well as being an awful communicator. I think bad bosses do a horrible job at informing you of the things that are needed for you to succeed in your job. And they don't even communicate those expectations to you. At their worst, I think a bad boss may be incapable of honoring your humanity, and they'll overwork you. They'll create a hostile work environment through things like gossiping, creating a me versus you sort of dynamic, and just not acknowledging those who are succeeding in the agency. On a less insidious level, I think a bad boss might just be indecisive and passive. They don't really receive concrete direction. They can be difficult. They may not even know how to do your job. And so some of these characteristics in mind, has anyone here experienced a bad boss?
Yeah, Brandon, actually, I feel like every single point you made, I can think of a boss that either had one of those or a combination of those characteristics. So I won't bore you all with all the different bosses that did that, but I will say I feel like the characteristics that were the most difficult to deal with, that really led me to want to leave, was that me versus you mentality for the boss and all the staff. And never really giving credit when it was due, be that through a simple thank you, listening to the work that you've done, and of course through promotions and pay when you know you're doing the work and it's not recognized. So yeah, I think you nailed all of them.
Yeah. So that first sort of answer that I provided was, how do you as an employee identify a bad boss? And the second prong, I think, is how does HR identify these characteristics of a bad boss when HR doesn't specifically work under the boss? I think if manager receives persistent complaints from employees regarding their behavior, whether it's, multiple complaints coming in, then a manager takes a week to respond to emails, that could be a pretty good indicator of a pattern of behaviors. Poor employee morale can also be detectable. HR could detect that through things like employee satisfaction surveys, or maybe even visible discontent at work. Things like that are connected to a bad boss. In employment reviews and things like that, if staff express that they feel like their growth is being hindered and they don't really have opportunities for upward mobility, this could be attributed to a poor supervisor. But all of these characteristics I described can lead to employees leaving an agency due to unhappiness. So if high turnover is being experienced, what sort of costs could a company incur due to a poor supervisor?
Yeah, I'll take that question. So losing workers can be a huge cost to a company. Management guru Peter Drucker once said the most valuable asset in the 19th century for companies was their equipment. But in the 21st century that we're in now, it's the employees that are the most valuable asset and the knowledge they have. So the cost of replacing an employee can be detrimental to an employer that loses employees through bad management. So it's not only is it the cost financially, because it's all the resources that go into training an employee, but also it's losing the knowledge they've gained over time for the company. Potentially could go to benefit a competitor. Also, it also puts a huge burden on the rest of the staff because they'll have to take up the workload that this employee leaves behind. So a company would totally benefit from having a system where managers are empowered to treat their employees well, as well as employees being able to assess their manager so that the manager is aware that they may be a burden onto the employees. Does anybody have any specific examples of how the cost can affect an employer?
Actually, yes. Thank you, Michael. Like you mentioned, there are direct financial and indirect costs due to employee turnover. According to Leahy Branham, the author of Keeping the People Who Keep You in Business, the cost of losing an employee ranges from 20% to over 200% of that employee's salary. So, for example, there's high turnover in my job currently. There's a manager that we would consider a bad manager who keeps having turnover on their core coordinators, which for their salary, it's about $50,000 a year. And they've had about 3 or 4 within 1 year, and that turnover has basically cost the amount of what the coordinator actually makes in the whole year. Including the indirect costs of loss of knowledge. There's a lot of people that were completely qualified and knew what they could. They provided skills that were beneficial to our company, but the loss of them leaving also created a loss of productivity in terms of indirect costs for our department. Partly because this loss of productivity came from employee burnout, people having to take over this job. The job doesn't end just because there's not a person there. But what does HR have to do with this? As Brandon mentioned, it's hard to tell what to do when the HR isn't necessarily directly in front of that or has experience with that boss. Mm-hmm. But they do have to pay attention to that because it is a responsibility to make sure that our employees are retained. It's not only about recruitment, but the retention plans that they create to have that, and creating systems that allow employees to, if they can't directly talk to their boss, can they talk to someone in HR to have that explanation or a way to communicate their grievances. There is laws to protect employees from retaliation, so that is something possible for HR to do.
Cool. Thank you. How can bad bosses be avoided?
I think, Michael, it starts with recruitment and making sure that through the job analysis that we are really looking at competency-based analysis and including questions related to emotional intelligence. So making sure not only does the person have, the hard skills, but the soft ones of understanding other people's emotions, recognizing their own. I think by putting that up front in the interview process, the company does 2 things. They put up front that it's important to have an emotional intelligence and showing that they're even aware of what that is. And number 2, it maintains the integrity of the interview process, making sure that all interviewees can be asked those kinds of questions. I know through experience, you can sometimes as a hiring manager get into the interview and be nervous and whether or not you can ask those additional questions to get to know someone. So by putting those in there up front, it allows the hiring manager to make sure they can really get to know everybody as who they are and not what they can do. Secondly, I think that the competency-based analysis and emotional intelligence needs to be training as well. Communication training is important so that each person, when the individual's already there, knows and understands and how to communicate their own issues, be it lack of understanding with others.
So Sarah, you mentioned these trainings. So how else can human resources respond to negative supervisor-employee relationships, and how do they protect employees from bad bosses?
So I'll take that question, actually. So one big thing to distinguish is whether or not if an HR manager receives a complaint from an employee, whether or not that's actually the manager is a bad boss, or if it's just, the bad relationship between the manager and the direct report. And if that's the case, usually just providing some mentorship, or really allowing the employee to understand the why behind whatever tasks they are working on. And the bigger picture, a lot of times will help resolve any of those smaller issues. But if an HR manager is actually getting reports of one of their employees being a bad manager, a lot of those will usually come through something called like a 360 review, which will take an anonymous survey of each individual person and their direct reports, their peers, as well as their supervisors. So from those types of reviews, you can really get a good picture of whether or not a manager is doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it really paints that clear picture. So at that point, if an HR manager is seeing that there's someone within their organization that is not really doing their job and providing the skills a manager should to their employees, there are a lot of internal and external trainings that they could provide, coaching and mentoring within the organization as well as externally. A lot of times having external mentors and coaches that you can really be candid with in discussion really provides a great resource to managers, as well as any of the academies and the personal trainings that Sarah had mentioned, really digging into the personalities of staff members as well as yourself, and having a good understanding of yourself as a manager. And if there's still no improvement for that person, at that point, as the HR manager, you can really look into, does this person need to be managing? Is there another way to go about this in the department that they don't have to have those supervisory roles, and can take those away and provide them to someone else that's better suited for that position? So, as we go into that, I'm wondering if there's a better way that we can prepare managers in the future so that they are set up for success rather than failure.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'll take that question. So sometimes managers are promoted to their position without any kind of training that would help them take on that new role. So working one-on-one with your peers is one thing, taking the lead on those projects, but once you get to a supervisory role, not only are you taking on the task of a leader, but you're also responsible for those employees and the goals they have to set. So HR should really take on the task of directly training managers for their position. So a great place to start would actually be leadership training. Leadership will teach them how to work through employee issues, how to delegate tasks, and how to motivate employees, and even how to provide feedback. So providing feedback is incredibly important because sometimes employees need guidance through their role, and doing it correctly will really help them grow and contribute to the company. Other trainings that would be great for an employee would be to focus on the manager themselves. So effective manager training, learning skills, how to project manage, and other technical skills. For instance, like when I became a manager, I had to take on an accounting program, and working through the issue and how to develop a budget was something that was specifically a very big task for me as a manager. So as a public employee, sometimes we just think our checks come magically, but then once you do manager role, you realize that you have to manage your resources effectively. So training.
Do you think that there are other resources that we could use?
Yeah, and as Michael was discussing, I think at least here in San Diego, there's some academies that you can attend. There's something called a Management and Supervisor Academy that's put on by the Center for Organizational Excellence, something that I think that is really beneficial to new supervisors, new managers, and something that is a really great tool for HR managers to provide for their organization. So I'd really encourage any HR managers, new employees that are having trouble with their supervisors, and or new supervisors or old ones, to really get some training and refresh those skills. So thank you for your time today, everyone. That is about our time limit. So Brandon Torres, Michael Goss, Diego Gamboa, Sarah Rosinski, I really appreciate your time today. I'm Lindsay Leahy, and I was your moderator for today. And tune in next time.
Thank you.
Okay.